good evening. Welcome to this 4th of July edition of our Bible study from the book of Acts. Look forward to studying with you. Hope you've had a good holiday, maybe spending some time with family, being outside on a beautiful weekend, good weather, warm but a little low humidity, so it's been a boost certainly. Acts 7 finds us back in the longest sermon in the book of Acts. It's the fourth one, and it's going to be instructive because Stephen, who is one of the early church servants, also a teacher, an advocate of the gospel, he's been charged with speaking blasphemous words against Moses and the law and the temple. And so he's brought up the charges against him. Essentially, it's a hearing. And yet I kind of insinuate that Stephen knew that he probably wouldn't make it down alive from this sermon. I can't think of a sermon I've ever preached when I thought, somebody's probably going to kill me before this sermon's over. Now, that could change in today's society for those who are younger, but I've never really felt that threat, but Stephen did. And if he had some inclinations about that, they would not have been wrong. So he dies, obviously, by the end of this chapter. That's going to be another challenge for the early church. How do you respond when someone is persecuted for their faith, when someone's a Christian martyr? That's part of the research and the thought we'll be looking at. Now let's kind of do a quick review before we get to Acts 7, verse 17. Stephen's been asked about, are these things so? These things that they charge you about, blasphemous words against the law and against this place, this temple. Stephen begins his sermon without a yes or a no. He begins this defense. It's a long one, and there's a purpose. There's a thread there. And that thread, we've noticed before, is kind of a repeating thing, or repetition of mistreatment on the part, often of God's own people against their own. We're going to see good people who are mistreated, and so Stephen is painting a portrait of something that would cause them to be able to see themselves in the proper light. Sadly, they didn't. They kind of perpetuated the cycle of violence there. And so the patriarchs were unkind to Joseph. That is literally a family. It's an in-house type of persecution. Israel is going to be resistant to Moses. We'll see that twice in this section we're about to cover. Israel is going to do that to God at least two different times. And I'm not saying just two, but two that are recorded here. And finally, the fathers to the Holy Spirit and to the prophets. And so Stephen is getting around to the main point about essentially saying no to the charge of blaspheming the law and the temple. He's going to point them to Jesus, who is the real focus, the real one to be listened to. And so as he's traced God's dealings with Abraham and the patriarchs, and when you get to Joseph, God kind of reversing the bad that the brothers meant against their younger sibling, and blessing them. But he leaves us there in Egypt, though 430 years in Egyptian bondage. I want to think about with you for a moment how that difficult times in our lives, sometimes we are tempted to believe, God, why have you left me here? Why would you expose me to this or allow me to undergo it? God has a purpose. It's not always evident. And I'm convinced it wasn't punishment for them. It's just that life is not always easy. One has said if we had heaven on earth, we might not wish to go to heaven. In fact, it would be just more of the same. And for a lot of people, that'd be wonderful. And yet it's not God's purpose or his plan for the here and now. And he goes on to say that when life tumbles in, and occasionally it will, don't mind it. It may be God's way of needling you to claim his promise of heaven, to want to endure or tough out whatever bad circumstance you may be going through in this life, with that long view of an eternal home that God's destined for us. Let's read together then, Acts chapter 7, verse 17. It says, but when the time of the promise drew near which God had sworn to Abraham. Now, think about that, how it transcended over 4 centuries. He told them they were going to be strangers in a foreign land. God could foresee history. He had mapped it out. And so the time drew near. God always keeps his promises. God always keeps his promises, which means he's always kept his promises. And any promises still on the table will be fulfilled, including his coming back. and his judging those, judging really all of us, but rewarding the faithful and cursing the ones who have been in rebellion against him. The time drew near. The people multiplied in Egypt. And I like verse 18. Think about it today and the principle it has for modern day applications. Till another king arose who did not know Joseph. Joseph got preferential treatment. He and his family allowed to stay in the land of Goshen. This is the aftermath of the famine when they've come and they've got grain. The God had providentially allowed Joseph to store up and elevated him to a prominent place there. He's in the top three in the whole land of Egypt. But things change. Another king arose who did not know Joseph. In our own country, we've seen changes in leadership, some of that political, some of it otherwise. Sometimes even in a congregation, maybe an elder arises who has a different view about how the congregation ought to go. We need to realize that while we often want things to stay the same, we may want the status quo. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. In Israel's case here, in this situation, actually a bad thing. Another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man, verse 19, dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. I want you to see how Stephen, who's preaching this, talks about the hour. He is a Jew, now a Christian, but he still is Jewish by means of his bloodline. And so he's talking to those who are Jews and not even thinking about being Christians, but he could find that common ground. He could get them to be in agreement with him on that. So they know that story. They know the end of Genesis, the beginning of Exodus there. And so the idea when the Hebrews are multiplying, that they get to realizing they pose a threat. Here's an army at our doorstep. And so what are we going to do? We're going to kill the male babies. What a terrible thing. You know, life is precious. Life is sanctified in the womb. And it's hard to see mothers endure a miscarriage. Some have had multiple miscarriages. What a hard thing that is. And to think about some that want life so desperately and for different reasons can't have a baby that reaches viability versus those who wantonly and casually kill the life within them. And so what this Pharaoh, this king of Egypt, does is not right. Certainly it is not warranted. It says at this time in verse 20, Moses was born. He's going to be the next. In fact, if you go down to about verse 41, is it 42? He's going to dominate the next section in the sermon here by Stephen. He's going to trace some of the high points, not everything obviously in the life of Moses. But at this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God. That's what I want to be. As a young person, as a middle-aged person, now as an older person, I can be and I want to be, in fact I need to be pleasing to God. It says he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months, but when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. Interesting how Acts is a good commentary on Exodus chapters 1 and 2 and vice versa. And verse 22 says Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Let me take you to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 talks about heroes of faith. And here's what it says first about Amram and Jochebed, although it doesn't mention them by name. Exodus does. So it's faith that allows them to do something, and then later it's going to be Moses' own faith. See that with me in Hebrews 11:23. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. In other words, he understood the Pharaoh's order, but they weren't going to do it. It kind of goes back to that principle of we ought to obey God rather than man, be it a political leader or whoever. But by faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. And it says that he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. He forsook Egypt. Here's the deal. When you look at Moses' life, it's 120 years, and it's conveniently divided up into three 40-year segments. Have you studied that? You've got the first 40 with Moses in Egypt. And with the exception of when he's a baby and he's nursed by his own mother, who is paid wages to do that, what a gig, what an interesting providential thing that was. And he took the tender heart of Pharaoh's daughter, who's bathing and sees this little baby in the basket, as most of our young people know from that story. She takes him and she's going to raise him, but not until his mother has instilled some values. It's going to be an important thing, an outcome in his life there. Moses was learned. He was brought up in that tradition. Now, why does Stephen bring this up in the sermon? He's got a direction. There's a purpose. It's not just citing facts that every Jew certainly would have known at that point. It says when he was 40 years old, here's the next, the middle section of his life, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. He looks like an Egyptian. He's been raised as an Egyptian, but he's Jewish. And he knows that tension between which path am I going to follow there. Seeing one of them suffer wrong, you go back and see more details in Exodus 2, incidentally. He defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. Next day, two of his brothers are fighting. It says that he supposed his brethren, Jewish brothers, would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. They did not understand. And so when one came back with, hey, are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian yesterday? He understood there would be a bounty on his head. Pharaoh would not take kindly to that development there. Back in verse 26, the next day he appeared to two of them to reconcile them as they were fighting and saying, men, you are brethren, you're brothers. Why do you wrong one another? But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? Perfectly dovetailing with that story in Exodus chapter 2. And then at this saying, Moses fled, became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. Now, that covers a lot of territory, geographically, more important, chronologically. And then you read about Zipporah and that development. He goes from being there in the royal family with all the luxury and all the attendants. You can imagine everything that he wanted at his disposal, to being just out in the wilderness, basically, serving as a shepherd. But he's going to be in a territory that's going to be important because he's a scout and a guide for what's later going to be the promised land. He'll be there knowing the lay of the land, the terrain during the wilderness wandering. And so that next 40-year phase begins. He begins a family there. It says, when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him. Think about the detail that's embedded in this story. Some of this quoted verbatim from Exodus. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. And then the Lord said to him, take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their groaning, have come down to deliver them, and now come, I will send you to Egypt. Follow this with me. Moses had been rejected by one of his own brothers, and I'm talking about not a family sense, but a national family sense, when he first had to flee Egypt. When he gets back to Egypt, and is before Pharaoh there, the 10 plagues, that long drawn-out story, there's going to be some rejection, some hesitance early on by his own people. He has to show them the wonders God has. And then when they finally cross the Red Sea, there's going to be story after story, chronicle after chronicle, looking at a pattern of rebellion against Moses. Let me read further here in Acts 7. We're getting close to a stopping point for today. This Moses whom they rejected, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel. That's a capital A in my Bible. Usually indicates deity, indicates a spiritual or heavenly being. The angel who appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. Now that's an amazing brevity of words to cover chapter after chapter through Exodus, some of those in Numbers and in Deuteronomy. And so had Stephen taken the time, and maybe he did, we have a condensed version perhaps, he could have talked about Korah's rebellion. He could have talked about his own literal brother and sister in the flesh. Aaron and Miriam doubting him, questioning him, and being judged temporarily at least because of that. Verse 37 says, "This is that Moses." Do I have your attention, he's saying? Now, you know Moses, this is that very same Moses who said to the children of Israel, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren, him you shall hear." And at this point, let me make clear the direction I think Stephen is going. Now, Stephen had been accused of saying blasphemous things against Moses, the law, the temple. Stephen is essentially saying, I'm all about Moses. I love the guy. I appreciate who he was, what he did, his plan in the economy of God. Have you thought about what Moses meant in Deuteronomy 18:15 through 18, where he makes a prediction, a prophecy about God blessing one who is Jewish among your brothers like me and needing to hear him in all things? Stephen is very clear on this. In his mind, they're not yet at that point. Most of them wouldn't be. But who he was talking about is Jesus. This Jesus whom Stephen is being persecuted for. The one Stephen is standing up for, obviously. And so this is he who was in the congregation. I wonder what your version says there in verse 38. The congregation. Some have the word church or assembly in the wilderness with the angel. Here's a capital A again. I think that's Jesus. The angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our fathers, and the one who received the living oracles to give us. It goes on to say our fathers would not obey but rejected. Why? In their hearts they went back to Egypt. It's almost like Stephen is saying, you know what, if I were to go back and say what you want me to say and brag on Moses and repudiate Jesus, I'd be going back. It'd be as foolish as Israel had they literally gone back to Egypt instead of complaining about the food, the manna and the quail, and when they were thirsty there. Stephen says, I'm not going back. God's got a different plan. There's a horizon for me. It's a better promised land than anything that would have a literal zip code that the Old Testament Jews would inhabit there. And so Jesus was active. I think it's interesting how that Stephen may have been hinting that this church, this assembly in the wilderness was like a model. It was a precursor for what was literally going to be fulfilled in the New Testament church. Both of them refer, watch it, to God's called out body, his selected followers. The church today is the only one. That Old Testament assembly would have been God's favorite or his blessed ones back then. Here's what Israel said in rebellion, not just against Moses, but against God. Make us gods, little g gods. Remember Aaron and the golden calf? To go before us. As for this Moses who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. I want to mark there verse 41 where we'll take up when it talks about that calf. And you could wish that would be an isolated incident. Hey, that we got that out of our system. No more temptations or allurements to idolatry. No, it was going to actually begin a pattern of even disobeying that first command, no other gods before me. Stephen's leading us in a direction. We'll catch that thread again. We'll follow where he's going about Jesus Christ being the only way. Next Sunday, Lord willing, we'll get there. We'll have our vacation Bible school next Sunday. I think we'll have time to get a study in before that starts, but be reading ahead in Acts 7:41. We may finish the end of that chapter about at that time. Thanks for studying along with me. I hope this is encouraging to you. I hope you'll read your Bible every day until we come back again to take part in this study. God bless. Until next time.